Well, I'm gonna kick it off. My name is Corinna Barcel. I'm the Vice President of the Haddonfield Historical Society. And on behalf of the Society, welcome. We're so excited to have everyone here tonight as part of our monthly virtual lecture series. It's something we started doing in light of the pandemic and not being able to have the buildings open, as a way of staying connected with everyone, our members, reaching out to new people. So we're so appreciative of our speakers tonight and all of you for joining us. So thank you so much. Without your support, we could not be doing this programming. So very appreciative. I would also encourage everyone to continue to visit the haddonfieldhistory.org site, our website, and click on upcoming events. Again, we're trying to have a program once a month. We have some really great programming also coming up in May and June. So please join us and continue to follow us on those pages to see what's coming up next. So from here, I'm going to just do a very brief intro of our speakers who are presenting tonight on the history of the Newton Union Burial Ground. Just a quick couple bits of housekeeping. If you are not muted, please mute yourself now. Sometimes we can do that for you on the back end, and sometimes we can't. So we want our speakers to be able to run the show here. So please make sure you're muted. Also, please use the chat box. Robert and Sean are welcoming questions at the end. We love adding that piece to our presentations. So, and it can be a question. I know as we logged in, someone joining us had a memory to share. You know, it can be something like that as well. So we are reserving time, so please use that chat box and we'll get to it at the end. And would love to hear from you. So from here, let me just very quick intro. Shawn Colborn lives in Haddon Township and is the chair of the Newton Union Burial Ground for the West Collingswood Extension Civic Association. Robert Shinn is the treasurer of the Camden County Historical Society. He co-wrote the local history book Along the Cooper River, Camden to Haddonfield. He is also the co-author of the nomination that put the Newton Union Burial Ground on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places. And I know they're going to have more to say about that. So I'm really going to just turn it over to them and let them give you all this great info. So as we turn it over, there might be a quick lag as we switch computer screens over to Robert and Sean so they can get their PowerPoint running. So if there is a quick lag there, just be patient as you switch from my face to theirs. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. We're so excited to have them as speakers and have you all with us tonight.
Okay, you ready for me, Corinna, to put the PowerPoint up?
Your show.
Okay. Let's see. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. This is Robert Shinn speaking. And our presentation is on the Newton Union Burial Ground. And we hope to learn from the past and preserve for the future. I don't know what else you had to do tonight, but it's an interesting crowd that gathers together on a Wednesday night to talk about a cemetery. They're scary, spooky places, and we normally avoid them, except maybe to visit them on Easter or Christmas and lay wreaths. And it's only one time around the year where we pay attention to them. That's only Halloween, where we like to raise the dead and put stones in our front yards. But seriously, burial grounds and cemeteries are critical sources of information on the lives of past individuals and societies. They are, in fact, a field of artifacts, and they are repositories of historical information. Unfortunately, a lot of that is disappearing, as many of the most historic burial grounds are not being well maintained, and gravestones and headstones are being vandalized. If we'd only listen, the dead speak volumes about America's past. And I can tell you that Sean and I and Andrew, who also worked on the nomination to put this on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places, feel like we know the people who are buried here. We've got to research them so much. We know who their children are, we know what they did in life, I know what happened to them. And it's just fascinating to get a window on the past here in Camden County. Our presentation today is really just to summarize the history of the Newton Union Burial Ground. We were brought together by Andrew LaVecchia, who prepared the original nomination to put this historic site on the state register and hopefully the National Register of Historic Places. And if those of you have a special craving for wanting more information and the detail that's required to put a site on the National Register, at the end we're going to give you the link to go to the State Historic Preservation Office site, and you can there download the full nomination that we submitted and which got the burial ground on the register. Stockton University publishes a history periodical about South Jersey issues, and if you go to, it's called Sojourn, S-O-J-O-U-R-N. You can order it on Amazon or pick it up in some local bookstores. But there's an article in there in the winter 2018 issue. It's also referenced at the end, titled the Newton Union Burial Ground, the site of Camden County's origin and the resting place of its earliest pioneers, written by Andrew and me and Sandra White-Gear, who I think I saw her picture, so I think she's probably on this. So hello, Sandra. It's just a good resource to have if we get the questions that, and I'm sure we will get the questions I can't handle. Let's go to the next slide, please. The Newton Union Burial Ground is located in Haddon Township in the West Collingswood neighborhood, southeast of the intersection of West Collins and Lynn Avenues. And it has its border on Newton Lake and its eastern border along the old Atlantic City Railroad tracks. You can see it here in the lower right-hand corner under NUBG is the location. It's not far from 3 other historic buildings, each with a connection to the burial ground. To the right, you can see the 1754 Joseph Thackara House. Going to learn a little bit more about the Thackara family in our presentation. It's really across the street from the 1821 Champion School. And I know Sandra can talk about that if we have a question to come up, but that's right on the other side of West Collins Avenue from the site of the burial ground. And it's just up the street from, you can see up there near Knight Park Playground, the Collins Knight House, 1825. The Thackara House is near the site of the first settler, Thomas Thackara. The Champion School is on land that was once within the northern border of the Newton Union Burial Ground. That land was sold to the group that built the school by the Haddonfield Monthly meeting. And many members of the Collins and Knight family are buried in this Newton Union Burial Ground. Let's go on to the next slide, please. In 1681, to escape religious persecution and improve their economic circumstances, 5 members of the Society of Friends chartered a 46-foot pink, that's the type of vessel you see shown here, to transport them and 16 other members of their families from Ireland to Salem, West New Jersey. Thomas Sharp was on board. He was one of the 5 friends, and he wrote the following account of the adventure some years later in 1728. He wrote, "Let it be remembered that upon the 19th day of September, in the year of our Lord 1681, Mark Newby, William Bates, Thomas Thackeray, George Goldsmith, and Thomas Sharp set sail from the harbor belonging to the city of Dublin in the Kingdom of Ireland in a pink called Ye Owner's Adventure, to transport us and that we might settle ourselves in West Jersey in America. And by ye good providence of God, we arrived in the Capes of Delaware on the 18th day of November following, and so up the bay until we came to Elsinburg, and were landed with our goods and families at Salem, where we abode the winter. Next slide, please. I'm going to continue Sharp's account. But being very favorable weather and purchasing a boat amongst us, we had an opportunity to make search up and down that was called the third tenth, which had been reserved for the proprietors dwelling in Ireland, where we might find a suitable place for so many of us to settle down together. I want you to make a note here that in order to settle the debts of a bankrupt fellow Quaker named Edward Billinge, who owned West New Jersey, William Penn and 2 other trustees divided the land into 10 parts called tenths and sold fractions of each tenth as proprietorships to investors. And so today's Camden and Gloucester counties were part of the third, which you can see here where the arrow is pointing, tenth, or since it was first settled by English Quakers who came from Ireland, it was also known as the Irish tenth. On to the next slide. Continuing the Sharp's account, being in these early times somewhat doubtful of the Indians, and at last pitched down by that which is called Newton Creek as the most invitingest place to settle down by. And then we went to Burlington and made application to the commissioners that we might have warrants directed to Daniel Leeds, the Surveyor General, to survey unto every of us so much land as by the Constitution at that time was allotted for a settlement, being 500 acres, or that we had a right to for a taking up under, which accordingly we obtained. Now, it's map's a little bit hard to read here. It was originally prepared by Thomas Sharp, who was the author of the words I was just reading to you in 1700. And right at about the location of where that arrow is, you can see the Delaware River on the bottom and Newton Creek flowing up and then branching off into three main stems. They built a small village for protection near the home of settler Mark Newby. That's where the red arrow is pointing. And they held their land in common because they were afraid to disperse for fear that they might be attacked by the Native Americans. A short time later, after assuring themselves of the peaceful nature of the local Lenape, they divided their 500 acres roughly as shown in this map on this slide. Newby owned what is now the West Collingswood Extension in Haddon Township, and Newby and Thackeray donated land for the meeting house and the burial ground. Next slide. In 1934, my predecessors at the Camden County Historical Society thought this such an important place that they put a granite boulder with a bronze plate summarizing the history of the grounds on a concrete foundation near the center of the grounds with this description. Next slide. Old Newton Friends Burial Ground. Near this site in 1681, Mark Newby, William Bates, Thomas Thackeray, George Goldsmith, Thomas Sharp, Robert Zane, and other immigrants from Ireland who came here in quest of religious liberty, founded the first Friends meeting of Old Gloucester County, held in the home of Mark Newby. Soon, William Cooper of Pine Point associated himself with this group of worshipers. The log meeting house, which they built here in 1684, probably stood on the adjoining premises to the north of this tablet. In this ancient burial ground rest the remains of those early spiritual pioneers, one of whom wrote that the settlement of this colony was not so much for their own tranquility, but rather for the posterity that should follow thereafter, and that the wilderness being planted with good seed might grow and increase to the satisfaction of the good husbandman. Next slide. So what did this first Newton meeting house look like? Well, this is one that's been maintained in rural Columbia County, Pennsylvania, near Numidia. It was built in 1695. It's called the Roaring Creek Friends Meeting House. It was made of logs, although you can see they're finished, and it has windows, and it's not as rustic as the kind of log cabin that Davy Crockett might have built. This is one of two extant meeting houses constructed of logs that are in the care of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. And the other is about 6 miles north of this in Catawissa. Let's go to slide 9. Now, also two of my predecessors at the Camden County Historical Society, Charles Boyer and Harry Marvin, drew this simple ancient Newton site map in 1934 based on deed descriptions. Lot A, which is just to the left of Newton Lake, represents the original 1-acre Quaker burial ground, AKA we call it the Old Newton Burial Ground. It was donated by Thackeray and Mark Newby in 1682. Sadly, Newby died shortly after arriving, so he was the first to be buried here in 1684. Lot B, just to the left of Lot A, is labeled the land on which the meeting house stood. Now, we don't know the exact spot. It may be the dotted square, which is kind of hard to see, extending out from Lot B into Lynn Avenue between Eldridge and Elm. It's obviously not there now. You'll see blacktop there where the road is. There are some references in the historical documents that the two buttonwood trees near the railroad station, just on the other side, may have shaded the meeting house. The white arrow on the right shows a wharf whose faint remains were visible in the 1930s. It was about 20 feet wide and extended about 30 feet. And there was an excavated channel that permitted access at low tides. This is before it was dammed and there was a lake. So kind of like the Cooper River south of the dam, I'm sorry, west of the dam, it was subject to tidal flows of 6 feet up and 6 feet down every day. The wharf was needed here because there were no roads, or not much of a road, more like a track. And most people traveled around by boat and built homes along the region's rivers and creeks, which were their highways. The old meeting house, Newton Meeting House, was also used for local government. I believe it was used right up until 1830 something. I can't remember the exact date. That was then moved on to Haddonfield. And it was also used as a school before they built the Champion School. Let's go to the next slide. Now, Quakers did not approve elaborate funeral processions or much elaborate ritual associated with religion at all. But in July 1703, Newton's dependence on rivers for transportation and widespread public esteem for a deceased member combined to create an elegant, if simple, funeral procession. It was in fact so noteworthy that James Logan, who was William Penn's man here in Pennsylvania, wrote about it to William Penn. He stated that between 9 and 10 at night, Esther Spicer, a widow, as she was undressing in bed in her own house, was struck dead with 2 of her servants by lightning, with 3 more escaping. 2 days later, friends moved the bodies from the Spicer house on the Cooper River, which, if you all know where the Federal Street Bridge is, that's about where the Spicers' ferry and house was. They moved it from that location on the Cooper River to the Newton Burial Ground on boats by water, accompanied by 30 boats and 400 people. And I'm going to read you John Clement's description of the procession. He said, the funeral occurred at night after her decease, the family and friends going in boats down Cooper's Creek to the river, and by the river, meaning the Delaware River, to Newton Creek, and thence to the Newton graveyard, a place of interment. Each boat, they being provided with torches, the scene upon the water must have been picturesque indeed. To the colonists, it was a sad spectacle when they saw one so much esteemed among them being borne to her last resting place. And to the Indians, it was a grand and impressive sight. Arisafa, the king, and others of his people attended the solemn procession in their canoes, thus showing respect for one, the cause of whose death struck them with awe and reverence. The deep, dark forest that stood close to the shores of the stream almost rejected the light as it came from the burning brands of pine carried in the boats, and as they passed under the thick foliage, a shadow was scarcely reflected from the water. Incidentally, William Cooper had a similar procession down the Cooper River to be buried at the same graveyard in 1710, but without the same large crowd that Esther Spicer had for her funeral. Next slide. Friends' burial grounds are plain and simple. Those of you who are from Haddonfield had walked by, you don't see the kind of tombstones you see in other Christian burial grounds, but you see very simple, almost like footstones like the one you see in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. Most of the early colonial Friends' burial grounds were simple, unbroken fields of unmarked graves. In fact, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, which is kind of like the authority for rulemaking for the Society of Friends in this area, specifically forbade grave markers of any kind until the last quarter of the 19th century. Quakers then viewed headstones as, and I'm quoting here, marks of superfluidity and excess, and, quote, inconsistent with the plainness of our principles and practice. Friends, that is Quakers, believed that even in death, they should bear testimony against practices that promote human vanity. Most colonial Friends' burial grounds were simple, unbroken fields, and in the mid-19th century, small, simple tombstones, like you see in the lower right, were allowed. The Quaker burial ground took on the appearance of the Burlington Friends burial ground shown on this slide, with a mix of unmarked graves and a later section with small headstones, such as the one for Susan Gaunt here in the lower right-hand side. Now, the Haddonfield Quaker burial ground today consists almost entirely of such simple stones, although it was not always so. Some of you have read about Samuel Nicholson in Dennis Rabel's book and in Doug Rauschenberg's and Kathy Tassini's book, Lost Haddonfield. Nicholson was a conservative 19th century friend who lived next to the Haddonfield Friends burial ground. And the story is told that Samuel Nicholson, who died in 1877, disapproved of gravestones and resurrected grave markers. And he would knock them down, push them below ground levels, and others would come around and take them up. I guess he was kind of like a latter-day Taliban back then against graven images. Next slide. Now, in the interest of time, we're only going to summarize some of the biographies of the most historic figures buried in the Newton Union burial ground. If you want more detail on their lives and what's important about them in our history, we're going to show you at the end a reference to Clement's 1877 book called Sketches of the First Immigrant Settlers in Newton Township. Our first fellow we're going to talk about is Mark Newby, who was a tallow chandler. I guess that means he made candles. The village was near his house. The first friends met in his house. And he was a man of considerable estate because he bought several large tracts of land. He was also very important in the early political world of the colony. He was a member of the Assembly from 1682 and 1683. And he was on the governor's commission to divide land, also on the Committee of Ways and Means. And he also worked with Jennings and others to oppose an attempt by the proprietor to pick governors in the future rather than being elected by the members of the Assembly. Now, what's most interesting about Mark Newby is that he was founder of the first bank in the state of New Jersey. He brought with him a large supply of commemorative coins, not currency, from Ireland. It was called by many different names, including St. Patrick's coppers and the St. Patrick's halfpenny. They're worth a lot more than that now on eBay. And I looked the other day and you can see them anywhere from $400 to $1,500 each. But these coppers in the early history of this colony filled an important need in local commerce and remained in circulation throughout the colonial period. Next slide. Among the notable burials, again, it talked about in Clement's book, or some that you heard me mention when I was reading you the account of their voyage. But Robert Zane actually came 4 years ahead of the group that Thomas Sharp came with, was a serge maker. These are interesting occupations these people had. And he came probably with John Fenwick and stayed in Salem for 4 years and sort of scouted out. He was like their early scout to see other locations where they might locate when they finally made the trip over. It's also been said that he may have married a Native American woman. Thomas Sharp was a Woolstead comber. He became so much more than that here, including being the teacher, the local teacher, but he's probably our best local earliest historian. He's a surveyor. A lot of his surveys are still available today. He was a constable. He actually was an estate manager. He worked for Elizabeth Haddon and her husband, John Estow, on many land transactions. And he was the clerk for Old Gloucester County and a judge. And he helped Elizabeth locate and arrange for the construction of the Haddonfield Monthly Meeting, right where the firehouse is today in Haddonfield. Thomas Thackeray was a stuff weaver. He had bought 400 acres. He's the primary donor of the land for the burial ground. He was a member of the Assembly. He was a judge. He was on the Council of the Proprietors. He was on the Land Commission. And he was one of those, along with William Cooper, who helped defend local Quaker orthodoxy against the teachings of George Keith, which we may talk about a little bit later. William Bates, probably the guy who has had the easiest time to find a job. He was a carpenter, and everybody needed to have their house built. It's believed that he built the Newton Meeting House. He's also on the Assembly, and he was on the Highway Commission, helped design and lay out where the roads would go. William Cooper, of course, is the sort of founder of the city of Camden, founding father, Camden County. He was one of the early signatories of the concessions agreements, which was a sort of predecessor to our own Constitution. Many of you know his family also had a monopoly on the ferry services to Philadelphia, probably for over 130 years. And he too was a defender of local Quaker orthodoxy against the teachings of Keith. And finally, John Kane came a little bit later. He was also a carpenter. He bought a huge tract of land from Turner, about 455 acres. He was a trustee on the Newton Monthly Meeting, and he served in the Assembly. Next slide. Of course, the Newton meeting eventually transitioned to the Haddonfield Monthly Meeting because Elizabeth Haddon's father donated land for not only the meeting house in Haddonfield, but for the burial ground. And before Elizabeth married, she had to get approval from the Newton Monthly Meeting to marry John Estow. She didn't get married in the meeting house. She got married in her own home, but they clearly attended the Newton Monthly Meeting until the Haddonfield meeting house was in operation in 1721. I think is when it's completed. Thomas Sharp helped Elizabeth cite the Haddonfield Monthly Meeting and had power of attorney for John Estow on many land transactions. The original Newton Meeting House was used and burned down until 1817. They still had occasional meetings back there even after the Haddonfield meeting was set up. And the Haddonfield Monthly Meeting, as the successor to the Newton meeting, also maintained the Newton burial ground going forward. Newton burial grounds wound down with the new grounds opening up in Haddonfield and then later in Camden. Next slide. Now, we're about to talk about probably the most interesting historical character associated with this burial ground. And I'm going to read the engraving that's shown on the stone here in the slide. It says, and I quote, "Here is no distinction. Rich and poor meet together. The Lord is maker of them all." Founded by James Sloan, 1790. Now, James Sloan is the founder of the Union Burial Ground, associated with the Newton Union Burial Ground, even if he may not actually be buried here. We'll talk about that in a minute. Newton meeting disowned James Sloan because he had, and I'm quoting here from the meeting minutes, why they tossed him out of the Society of Friends. He, quote, "hath for some time past so far given way to a separating spirit as to appoint meetings under the profession of worship, in which meeting he has undertaken to appear as a minister, which conduct being manifest deviation from our discipline, a disownment was entirely proper and necessary." In other words, he was trying to start his own religion, which is kind of a blend between Quakerism and Methodism. He also had joined the local militia and fought in the American Revolution. Well, that wasn't why he was disowned. It was because he was trying to start his own religion. Anyway, he laid out this burial ground in 2 stages. The first was a very small parcel for, we think, his family primarily, but then he expanded it in 1790 to be almost an acre, 1791, and then closed it with a brick wall. And it was open to all non-Quakers, former Quakers, the people who weren't Quakers, whereas the Newton burial ground was only open to members in good standing of the Newton and then the Haddonfield monthly meeting. Next slide. Where is James Sloan buried? Well, did we miss a slide? I guess not. No, that's good. Let me tell you about James Sloan first. It wasn't just because he has been disowned. Apparently some of his children had married out of meeting, and either for both of these reasons can be read into the tablet, which James Sloan placed on the brick wall around the grounds. Now, Shawn's going to describe a little bit later the impact of the American Revolutionary War and other veterans who are now buried in the Sloan section of the burial ground. But Sloan is an interesting historical figure because he held a series of elected and appointed offices, ranging from being Newton's representative on the Gloucester County Board of Freeholders to being elected to Congress from this district. And in 1794, he chaired the Gloucester County Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and a year later was one of 3 New Jersey delegates to a convention of state abolition societies in Philadelphia. He was a strong supporter of Thomas Jefferson. He organized and became chair of the New Democratic Republican Party organization in Gloucester County, and he won a seat in the upper chamber, the Senate of the New Jersey legislature in 1801. And in 1893, he won a seat in the United States Congress, where he served for 3 terms. But he broke with this party in 1808 and was a fierce opponent of us declaring war on Great Britain in 1812. And in 1810, he enlarged the cemetery and assigned it to a small group of trustees for $1 to promote and establish a burial place on just and liberal principles, called and known by the name of Union. That's where it got its name. There's a lot more that we could talk about. There's 2 papers at the end that I refer you to that you can read about his career in Congress and his attempt to not only oppose the war, but to oppose slavery. He even wanted to move the capital back to Philadelphia from Washington. He thought it was captured by the slaveholders of Virginia. But in 1812, 1813, he had financial difficulties, and Gloucester County Sheriff sold all his property in New Jersey to pay off his debts. and he moved to upstate New York, where he and his wife, we now find, are buried in a small cemetery in Southport, New York. For many years, there was no evidence of the cemetery, but they were unearthed in 1979 beneath several inches of sod. And you can see this is the one on the right. Their markers are very simple with no creative epitaphs or other words of mention. Now, it's interesting that there's a gravestone for James Sloan is etched with the same date of death, also stands on the Union burial ground in West Collingswood, New Jersey. And when the I guess it was the Daughters of the American Revolution and other local volunteers in West Collingswood years ago decided to apply for and obtain markers from the Veterans Administration, like you get in just about any cemetery, and replace those that were not replaced, but add them to the graves of the veterans here in this cemetery. There was one etched for James Sloan, which you can see in the slide, right? What you see right here. So it's hard to read the old stone, but it does identify James as a veteran of the American Revolution. And Shawn and I think that we got to do some further research to find out even if there's a body beneath this gravestone. And if not, if there is, who's the James Sloan who's buried in Southport, New York? A very, very interesting challenge. I think I'm to the end, Sloan.
Okay, I'll pick up from there. I'm Shawn Colborn, and I'm not a historian, but I have a medical background and became interested in I guess it would be the Union side of the burial ground, and not even aware of the Newton original Quaker side, but because of the Revolutionary War soldiers and the military history. So I'm going to share with you a lot of maps and some of the modern stuff, probably post 1850, more around 1890 and on. So let's see here. There we go. All right, cool. So the train station was built in, the lot was sold in 1889. You can see a train station here in the right bottom, I guess, middle portion of the screen. And then the Friends Burial Ground and the Sloan Burial Ground, along with Newton Creek on the left side of the photograph or document here. Back in 1886, George Powell described the cemetery as enclosed by a brick wall, and it was overgrown with low trees and vines. And it seems to have gone through that kind of stages in cyclical over and over again, I guess, in the mid 1800s and on until Haddon Township sort of took over the care of the grounds at up to this point in time currently. But the sale of the train station lot was done by the Champion Land Company, the Collingswood Land Company, to the Atlantic City Railway. And we're trying to get that building placed on the National Historic Registry too, but we're just waiting on an application that we sent into the state of New Jersey. But the land sale was for $800, and $300 of that was to be used to maintain the land as a park for the rest of history. So let's see here. It's also like this area here where the train station is where we believe that the Quakers, when the Irish 10th came over, that they created their, I guess, like village around that before they felt it was safe, that the Indians weren't a threat. And then they all kind of scattered out to each of their lands that they had purchased. My side where I live is on the top part of this picture here. And we live on, or the West Collingswood extension is in the Mark Newby's farm. And then across the tracks off of this photograph here would be where Thomas Thackeray's land was. And this is kind of, I guess, where Thackeray and Newby donated this as part of the cemetery donation. So here's an interesting photograph. This is from Camden County Historical Society has this in their archives, and all the photographs that you're going to see in here are from the Camden County Historical Society. But this is from Samuel Nicholson Rhodes, who is a Quaker and is buried in the Haddonfield burial ground. He served as the clerk for the Haddonfield monthly meeting, and he was also a nature photographer and started the Delaware Valley Ornithological Club. And his papers are stored in the Historical Society of Haddonfield's archives. But the interesting part of this photograph is this is where the train bridge is that goes over Newton Lake. The landing may have been here somewhere in the photograph, but you can see this brick wall that was enclosing the burial ground. It's kind of hard to make out perspective if this brick wall here is just enclosing the Sloan section or the Union section of the burial ground, or is it enclosing both the Quaker side and the Sloan section, which I'm not quite sure. So this is a satellite image from the U.S. Geological Service, and they use LiDAR on their satellites to map out the country, the entire country. They use lasers that come down from the satellite. It's light detection and ranging, and it can see through vegetation, trees, stuff like that, and then map out minute changes in the ground. They also use it on helicopters, drones, planes, but we're looking at using LiDAR, and we'll talk about that later, but it's been used a lot in archaeological studies. And I was thinking this area here in the photograph, if you can see, it's very flat, and then there's a slight white line that comes around, and you can do this, you can see where that is. And I thought, that looks like a wall, or the remnants of a wall. So I ran it past Andrew and Bob, and we're not quite sure what it is. And I forget the person's name that lived in our section of the township, but he said in high school, there was a project, or in grade school or high school, he said there was a project where they did map out the four corners of where the brick wall used to be. And they ended up burying it back since they weren't going to restore the wall at that time. But next slide. Here's another photograph. This is also from Rhodes back in 1909. And this is a brick wall here. This side is concrete and stucco. It's still standing today. And these tombstones along that wall here are pretty much gone or missing. And probably about, I would say, a third of these are missing at the current time. But the brick wall here is totally gone. You can see the train station here in the background. And I'm not quite sure what this structure is over here, but that would be in the area where the old meeting house stood, quote unquote. But I'm not even really sure what that is. It looks like it's made out of logs and some kind of tower. But this kind of shows what I guess the brick wall may have looked like back in 1909. Again, another perspective. This is facing, the camera would be facing south in this photograph, or south east, and you can see the train bridge going over Newton Lake here. This building, I'm not quite sure what it is. It's on the other side of the tracks in Collingswood, and I'm guessing it's not standing anymore. But most of the tombstones that you see in this photograph are not standing anymore, or missing, or buried under the ground, and we can't locate them. The concrete wall would have been somewhere in this section. This is not here anymore either. I'm not quite sure what that concrete structure is, but you can see how the vines and everything kind of were starting to overgrow that area, and it really needed to be cleaned out. So some of the past conservation efforts for the cemetery, there was a group of women who met in the Indian King Tavern, or Indian King Tavern, I'm saying that correctly, in Haddonfield. They were the ladies auxiliary to or the Friends of the Newton Union Burial Ground, or the Union Burial Ground. And they met from, the first meeting was in 1925, the 25th of May in 1931, and they held their last meeting on the 28th in 1936 of October. They transferred the deed. Over the time, they really tried to maintain the cemetery, and they had some funds, but they struggled through the Great Depression, and that final meeting, they transferred the deed over to Haddon Township. They met with some local officials here, and they decided to sign it over. But I think that they realized they couldn't take care of it, and all the funds that they had in their bank, they transferred over to Haddon Township at the time. So let's see. So there was some tombstones removed in probably around 1931. They were trying to make a flat area for a playground, and the Friends gave authorization to remove some of the tombstones and flatten the ground out. And Frank Stewart, who was part of the Gloucester County Historical Society back in the 20s, he said it was the greatest historical outrage ever perpetuated in South Jersey, and challenged the people who thought otherwise or wanted to make more changes like this to actual physical altercations outside if they wanted to disagree with him about it. But these stones here, we're not sure if these are the stones that were removed or if they were just stones that were loose in the cemetery, but they put this stone, it looks like a well, but it's just a stone square that they put stones inside and outside. They mounted them in here for, I guess, to display them for historical purposes. But I'm not sure if these were in the Newton side of the burial ground or if they came from the Sloan section of the burial ground. There's 32 stones in there, and most of them are illegible now. One on the opposite side is William Hug, and the Hug House, which everybody kind of knows, was taken down when they're building that interchange on Route 42. But his gravestone is in this cement square here. There was also a lot of broken fragments, glass bottles, cigarette butts, stuff like that, that were inside this, I'm going to call it a well. But Haddon Township came out and they cleared out the well, and in there looked like pieces of tombstones. So we went through and gathered all of them, and Andrew Lavecchia and I took them up to the train station, cleaned them, and photographed and cataloged them. And they're sitting in the second story of the train station currently. And also in the train station in the basement, there are some loose stones, and one stone going up the staircase in the train station is sitting on the second floor. So there are a lot of stones that are missing, or stones that we can't locate. There's rumors that there's some stones in the lake too, that were thrown in there back in the 1970s and 80s. People may have moved the stones and threw them in the lake, but that's rumor at this point. And I would like to know if they're there. I'd like to know the location of the wharf, but at this point in time, we're not really sure. This photograph too is also part of the Camden County Historical Society's collection. And Bob Shinn and I were looking at this, and these tiny little stones here, they look like they would fit in with the style of Quaker stones. And in the center of the photograph is this faint white line here, which we think is Newton Lake. So this would be in the cemetery facing south. And this is all overgrowth, I guess, from what Prowl kind of described over the years. And I'm not sure where these stones are. I haven't seen anything like this in the cemetery. So I'm either wondering if they're on the Newton side of the cemetery where the original Quakers are buried, and are these stones underground, or are these some of the stones that were removed in the building of the playground? But I'm not really sure. I wish we had more context on the photo, but you may have to go back and look and see if there's any more information on the back side of that. So here are some of the maps. After the deed was transferred to Haddon Township in 1935, funds were also transferred to them. And the goal from the Women's Auxiliary was to have the the brick wall rebuilt to make the cemetery historically accurate. And when the funds were transferred in the 1930s, there were 100,000 bricks procured to rebuild the wall. And we don't really know what happened to those bricks, but the wall was never reconstructed. And this map was made by the WPA in 1937. And it gives a good location of some of the graves. And I guess the tombstones were more legible back then. But you can see here, Heritage, here's Collings. And there was also a poor row, which may have been in this section somewhere. And the Gilmore stone, if people go to the cemetery, the Gilmore stone is probably roughly maybe in this area here. And then this is an undeveloped tract back here. And here's that cement well or square with the 32 tombstones that are enshrined in that. And then the monument that Bob showed in the beginning is located here. This is a really detailed map. There was a more current version that Bob had shown with Lot A, Lot B, but this is also, there's so much detail in this map, you can stare at it for hours and try to figure out the dimensions of the lots and the distances between certain objects. But here's the West Collingswood train station right here. And this is Collings Avenue. Over here would be the Champion School. And in the more recent or current map that Bob has displayed, they showed the location of the old meeting house as being in this area. And then on this map, it's that same square box is located more north of Eldridge on Lynn Avenue. So where is the exact location? I don't think we really will know. But what we did read is some of that, the meeting house kind of encroached into the cemetery or the train station lot. And I'm wondering if we might be able to find that out through surveys later on. Here is that historical marker here, and then further down would be where that cement square is. And here on this little lines coming around here are the remains or remnants of a brick wall and some brick wall that was located there. So we know it was there. Just how much of the cemetery did it enclose? Was it just the Sloan side of the cemetery or Union burial ground, or did it come down to where the curb is here? All of this is where the original Newton Quaker burial ground was. And if you go to the cemetery and look, these are all unmarked graves here. So the graves probably come all the way up to the curb along Lynn Avenue, and you wouldn't even know that you're standing in a cemetery at that point. Another map, I thought I'd show this. I thought this was a cool map because it may be useful later on if we do ground penetrating radar surveys or we try to map out grave locations in the Union section of the burial ground. But it shows the equal division of family plots and individual lots and the undeveloped section back here. This is based off of the WPA maps. And again, there's the monument here with the American flag and the pole and the stone cement well. So back in the 1950s, the Boy Scouts came and they cleaned up the cemetery. And then in 1970, 1976, Tom Priori and Tom Hansen from the Collingswood Middle School came over with their 7th grade class, and they did some etchings and transcribed what was on the tombstones at the time. Now, if anybody is affiliated with Collingswood High School, these etchings are supposed to be stored at Collingswood High School. I haven't had a chance to go over and see them myself, but we did try one day, Andrew and I think Kate Mallory was with us, and we tried to etch the stones, and we couldn't get anything to show up through the biofilm that's on there. There's just a lot of deposit that's on the stones. And in the 1980s, this is a picture of one of the Boy Scouts setting in those veteran tombstones that you see, or grave markers. There is a set of veteran grave markers that run parallel to the tracks on the backside of the Sloan section. And I believe that they were just grave markers that they couldn't find the original location of the grave, and they just placed those markers there to have them in the cemetery. And going back to the veteran gravestones. So everybody that served in the Gloucester County Militia, that is from this meeting or area are buried in the cemetery. So there are 24 Revolutionary War soldiers, one from the War of 1812, which is David Henry, and one from the Civil War, James Collins. And all this research was done by Marilyn Tulk, who was part of the Haddon Township Historical Society. And there was an excerpt that she wrote, and I thought this was pretty good. This is back in 1906. I'm going to read it. We feel this piece of heritage should be preserved. The children use this as a playground, and the gravestones are broken and vandalized. Many people in the area have toted them home or have them by their hearths. To them, we make a plea to return them. We are recommending that a fence or a wall be erected with the planting of rambler roses or bushes to make some natural boundary. Perhaps if the adults and some show some interest and pride, it will become infectious to the youth. What better time than this bicentennial year? So she did the research in 1976. The stones were procured through the VA, and the Boy Scouts placed them in 1982. And I thought that was really good by Marilyn. I think we all really need to know how historic this site is. And looking at the foundation for America and the freedom of religion, and it shows how the American Revolution created a divide, not only between religious sects, but also between, I would say, just normal people. Some people were Tories and loyal to the crown, and families split because of that. And some wanted to be part of the United States and fought with Washington. But this clearly shows the effect of the American Revolution on the Quakers at the time, and to the point of where Quakers that either one sympathized with the American Revolution and split from the crown couldn't be buried with their family on the other side of this split lot in the original Newton burial ground. And they had to create their own burial ground and were interned there at the time, which is, I think, just amazing, really. So going to present day, and if you go back to the one slide where you saw all those tombstones, well, this is what it looks like now. It's pretty sparse. The veterans come in on Flag Day and they place a flag. They have the flags at all the veterans' graves, and they have ceremonies. But it just seems like over time, the flags start to degrade. That between weed whacking and lawn mowing, they get knocked down, and the markers are becoming damaged. Also, I went around and put some white survey flags in front of every tombstone to try to attract them and what we have left. But it just seems like they rusted over time too, and were knocked down with lawn mowing and stuff like that. So the effort that I kind of made was in vain at the time. But what we really need to do is we need to reset a lot of these fallen stones and then restore them, clean them with, there's a solution called D2 biological solution, and it needs to be undiluted when it's used on the tombstones, and you need a water source to wash it off after. But it's $42 a gallon and needs to be undiluted, and I'm pretty sure we would need a lot of D2 biological solution, but that's where grant money and stuff like that, and I think could come into play in the future, but we'll talk about that. Quite recently, this is a marker. This is the marker that's going to be placed along Lynn Avenue, and Andrew LaVecchia pretty much designed this marker along with people over at the Camden County Historical Society. And then they asked me to fill out an application to get grant money released so that we can put this marker in the ground. So we just need funds to do it. But it's going to be an aluminum marker. It's going to be powder coated, weather coated, and should last for quite a while. But it's the same type of marker that's in front of the Champion School. And I think there's another one in Bonside at one of the historic sites there. But the Camden County Historical Society is placing these at the historic sites. And it's really cool because it gives you a quick map of the cemetery a brief history, and some of the images from the past. So what do we know? What we know currently is that all of the early Quaker graves are unmarked. Everything on that Newton side, there are no grave markers. And if they are there, they're either buried underground, and we won't be able to find them unless we do some kind of ground penetrating radar or something like that to find out where the bodies are. There are two separate cemeteries, definitely, the Union side or Sloan section and the Newton side, with over 350 graves. And a lot of the families, the Thackeray's, Collings, Heritage, Albertson, the 37 last names account for about 70% of all the burials in the graveyard. If you go to findagrave.com, Bob and I have thoroughly gone over the Find a Grave, and we think that there are a lot of names listed in the Find a Grave website that are not actually buried in the burial ground. But it is in South Jersey. It's probably the largest collection of veterans of the American Revolution in a single cemetery. And Bob and I talked about that, and he said he knows of no other graveyard that has more of them. And some of the stones were removed from their graves. Will we ever find them? Well, probably not. If they're in the lake, maybe we will one day, if we can try to find the wharf, which I think would be really cool if we could find the original location of the wharf. And the tombstones, if they are in the lake, probably wouldn't be very far from the shoreline. So, and if anybody does have them by their heart and they want to return them, please feel free to bring them over to the train station. And Bob, Andrew, Sandy, and I probably would be pretty happy to get them back. We don't know where those unmarked graves are. Like I said, the missing tombstones, the location of the dock, and the foundation of the original Quaker meeting house. Every time I drive my car past Eldridge and up Lynn Avenue towards Collins, I wonder if I'm driving over the site of the original Quaker meeting house. But it's got to be there somewhere, if there is anything left. And LiDAR from drones and stuff like that may help find that foundation in the future and maybe get a better resolution than what we could get from me messing around with a USGS satellite survey and staring at the site trying to pick out details. But LiDAR mapping would be really great. If anybody has a drone with LiDAR and would like to LiDAR the site, let us know, please. Ground penetrating radar, again, pretty expensive. We would need to get grant money, but it is on the state historic registry, and we are waiting to hear back from the National Park Service on our National Historic Registry status. But that would also open us up to wider amounts of grant money and stuff. We need to clean and reset the tombstones, and some kind of, to me, and this is just my personal opinion, I would love to see the brick wall back to make it look like it did back in the 1800s. I think that would be cool, and it would also give a slight boundary to let people know they are entering a cemetery. And a fence, I'm not quite sure if a fence is a good idea, not like a cyclone fence, but if it was something really nice, maybe it would help protect some of the stones and from people going into the cemetery and sitting on top of them. I don't think people destroy them on purpose, but things just happen over time. Tree branches fall on them, storms, nature, they just fall over. So, and stopping people from metal detecting, and I know Andrew has said this a lot to some people in the cemetery, but they are digging in a state historic site, and there are a lot of historic artifacts that I'm sure that you could probably find metal detecting in the cemetery, but it is a protected site, and I'm sure they found cool stuff, but it's probably not really appropriate. And how do we do it? Again, grant money, donations. Maybe the township has some a slush fund that they could contribute to some of this. Volunteers like myself. I just had time on my hands and said, let me go up there and check this out. And that's how I got involved. And getting on the National Registry of Historic Places would really help. And why is the place really significant? Again, it's extreme age. It's part of the foundation of our county and township. It was founded in 1682 again. We went over all of this, but it's associated with the founding of New Jersey as a colony and the settlement of Camden County and Gloucester County. And a lot of its the families that founded this area, like Bob says in his book that he wrote, their names are on a lot of buildings like Cooper Hospital or the Robert Zane School. They had a huge influence. Nicholson Road, just a huge influence on the area, and they had a disproportionate influence on the economic development, cultural development of the counties. They did support early self-government and protected concessions and religious toleration, which is, again, one of the freedom of religion is one of the founding principles of our country. And Bob, I'll hand this back over to you, because here comes the Keith schism again, which I actually went back and asked Bob while we were developing this. I was like, all right, well, here in my part of the presentation is leaders stop the spread of Keith schism, but I think Bob can explain that a lot better than a respiratory therapist could. So Bob, you want to take over again?
Yeah, although this could probably take another hour, and I'm going to take 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I want you all to remember George Keith as the divider. You know, you talk about people the president's talk about bringing people together. Well, he was the original divider, not only in terms of religion, but he actually physically was hired by the governor of East Jersey, who at the time was Robert Barclay, an associate of William Penn's, to come and survey the line that divided the province of West Jersey from East Jersey. So he divided the state. And if you want to see the physical remains of the division, the so-called Keith line, all you need to do is go to Princeton and drive Province Line Road, because that is the sort of the westerly boundary of the province line that divided the West Jersey from the East Jersey colony. These were reunited back together in 1702, but he never quite finished the job, and he became saddened by the realization that Quakers here in America were losing touch with Orthodox Christianity, and he began to have sharp disagreements with his fellow believers. Of course, he was trained as a Presbyterian minister in Scotland before he was converted to become a member of the Society of Friends by none other than George Fox. But he had no hesitancy to challenge their lack of dogma, their lack of knowledge of the Bible. He wanted to create basically a catechism of Quakerism, and he really got a following here in Philadelphia and in New Jersey, and was eventually even to the point of advocating for abolition of slavery among the members, the so-called weighty friends in Philadelphia who owned slaves, and got so much on their nerves that they disowned him. And he went back and appealed that to the London Yearly Meeting, and they disowned him too. And guess what? He got ordained an Episcopal minister and came back to Burlington, another place in New Jersey. And I think he converted my early Quaker ancestors in Burlington to become Episcopalian or Church of England people years ago. So he's an interesting character, and anyone who studies that era needs to understand his impact on religious thought and for early abolition advocacy. As far as the rest of this slide is concerned, the reason why it's up here is that both William Cooper and Thomas Thacker represented the Newton meeting and the Philadelphia meeting in writing letters back to the London Yearly Meeting as to why Keith was dangerous and shouldn't be allowed to remain in the society. Sloan's Union Burial Ground is a physical reminder of Quaker pacifism and its discipline. You can't keep people in line if they stray. If they don't marry within the church, they don't follow the peace testimony. In addition to being separated from meeting, you're separated in the graveyard. We have probably the largest number of Revolutionary War vets in South Jersey, most of them probably former Quakers. And this place is also significant because it's basically the birthplace of the Haddonfield monthly meeting. And as we discussed earlier, it's the Newton monthly meeting sanctioned the Estelle Haddon marriage before the whole meeting was moved to Haddonfield. Next slide.
Well, is there anyone?
Here are the suggested readings, which I think is going to be available on a recording, and maybe the Historic Society of Haddonfield will put this up separately, so people who want to read more about this burial ground and the people that are associated with it. You'll know as much as we do easily by reading that. Here's, thank you for your attendance. We're open to questions. If you have any you want to just send to us privately, here's our email addresses. And
Yep, feel free to contact us. You can also go to the Newton Union Burial Ground Facebook page too, and follow kind of any developments that come up. I usually post it on there and follow it and answer back. So,
Bob and Shawn, this is Sarah. There's several questions for you in the chat. I don't know if you got a chance to look at those. We are running out of time, though. Maybe what we could do is have people email you, or Shawn, if you want to look at them briefly and just see if there's one or two that you want to pick out to answer right now.
sure. Let's see here. I'm trying to find the question. Oh, chat. Here we go. All right. Let's see. Bob, did you have access to the chat too, or?
yeah, I've answered some online, but there was one question about the Cooper's involvement with slaves. And I actually have a chart which I can send out, but in a nutshell, within the first two generations, I'm talking about William Cooper, the immigrant who died in 1710, he did not own any slaves, nor did his son William or his son Joseph, but his son Daniel, who operated the ferry south of Cooper's Point, did own slaves and did let his ferry be operated as a slave auction site, as did Joseph Cooper's son Benjamin. Benjamin didn't himself own slaves, but he did allow slave auctions to take place at his site. Now, Joseph Cooper had, the son of William, had two other sons, Isaac Cooper and Joseph Cooper, and of course, Marmaduke Cooper. Joseph and Isaac and Marmaduke were associated with our headquarters of the Camden County Historic Society. If any of you have been there, it's called Pomona Hall, the old historic building that's part of our complex there. That was built by William Cooper's son, Joseph, and Isaac and Marmaduke owned slaves, and we recognize that there were slaves associated with Pomona Hall, either living in or living outside it. I should note that many of the Coopers were also early advocates of abolition, and that needs to be recognized, that most Quakers, by the time of the Revolution, were persuaded to free their slaves, and then took the unusual step of advocating outside of their religion to advocate for other people to abolish. So some of the earliest abolitionists were members of the Quaker set, including the Cooper family.
If I see here, all these guys had families. Shame nobody knows about anything about women pioneers. Yeah, I haven't seen much written on women of the area, but there is a lot about families. Women, most that I found with women are through marriage and who they married.
Well, there is, of course, the biography of Elizabeth Haddon Estelle that was published by the Historic Society of Haddonfield. And you can, at least the women in her generation and with whom she associated are discussed at great length in that biography. But the earlier ones that came associated with the so-called Irish Quakers, we probably need to look at the extant monthly meeting records to see to the extent to which they are discussed. Of course, women had their own meeting later on. I don't know when they started in Haddonfield. Maybe some other of our people participating in this call might have some idea on that.
Sean, my name's
Yes.
Chris Cunningham, and I was born and raised in the extension and through the 60s and 70s and 80s, and ran that neighborhood a lot all around there with playing my brothers and sisters. Never do I remember us ever, or anybody that I know from that era, disgracing that graveyard and throwing stones in the lake, in the creek. Most of the times, if we ever found them broken or anything, we brought them up to the Civic Association and stored them in the basement.
They're probably the ones in the basement. Yeah.
Correct. I was also the president of the Civic Association at one time, back in, I think it was the mid 90s. And I wrote a letter to Robert Andrews at one time trying to procure funds or some information on how we could preserve the graveyard. And I was very interesting to me tonight to find out that Haddon Township had taken over and received 11,000 bricks, did you say at one time?
Over 100,000 bricks.
Okay, over 100,000 bricks. I mean, is there any way the federal government could step in here? I mean, this is a big piece of history for the United States, not just New Jersey.
No, absolutely.
The beginning, the founding foundation of this country. And I thought that, I never gained any momentum with what I was doing. I guess maybe I was going through the wrong channels, but at the time, Fred Litwack was also doing the thing with Champion School. So, and I had, gotten some information from him on how I was trying to approach things, and I just never gained any traction. So that's all.
No, that's great to know. We did find a lot of old Civic Association documents in the train station. A lot of them were part of Fred's files, and I haven't seen your letter, but I think that once this gets on the National Historic Registry, and Bob, you can help me out there, but I think that would open us up to a lot more funding through the government.
I think the wall would be the best thing. A brick wall, like you said, would be with doing the ground penetrating radar. If they could find that wall and at least outlining it, it would be a huge success.
Yeah, I think so too. I agree. And every time I drive past the that brick company that's on Cuthbert Boulevard, going up towards Haddon Avenue, I always think, oh man, I wonder if they would ever donate bricks to a project like this. I think they were involved in building Citizen Bank Park, so this would be like a drop in the bucket, over 100,000 bricks. But I don't think it needs to be a high wall, but something to add the definition and make it almost the height that we see in that one photograph would be really cool. At least in my opinion. I'm sure there's other opinions out there, but here's one. There's something about British soldiers. Yeah, I'm not aware of any British soldiers. There was also some rumors of Indian burials and an Indian princess buried in there, and I found some information in the Collingswood Library that said that was just a rumor. So if you hear about any Indian graves, that seems to, I don't have any evidence that there are. Clement's book, yeah, Clement's book is really good.
Has anybody gone through the Board of Freeholders and asked them for any help?
Andrew is director of county planning, and he has some connections, I would hope, with the freeholders. But at this point in time, if Andrew is in the chat, I don't know if he is. That would be a great question. Bob and Sandy, have you ever heard of anything from freeholders? It's kind of like above my pay grade. So,
yeah, I'm not aware that we've made any formal request yet. Our mission was to get the site listed on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places first, and then hopefully the National Register. And we thought that once that was obtained, it would be a lot easier to make requests for grant funds and other things to do the kind of studies we're talking about, and or maybe to do things, something like some kind of a wall or enclosure around the burial ground.
Okay.
The grading of the stones, like in those pictures from 1909, and what it looks like today. I mean, that's 100 years, but it was hundreds of years. Like some of those stones were already 100 years old. What's the difference in how the stones are deteriorating between 1909 and now, and then previously to 1909? Is it like pollution and cars and stuff? Well, what's going on?
That's a great question. I'm not really sure.
Because they're like stark white, in the 1909 pictures.
Yeah, and some of those stones probably were there since the 1700s. So
Yeah.
the process is we're over 100 years now from 1909. So I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. But I know a lot of monuments and stuff like that use this D2 biological solution to upkeep them, and it's used in a lot of cemetery preservation projects. But I think a lot of it is just biofilm, and then once you start to get a biofilm on there, it just tends to grow between calcium deposits, fungus, stuff like that. But that's a great question.
It's possible
really
also that I suppose that the stones were just better maintained up to that point. I don't know.
I think pretty much after, like in the late 1800s, it was pretty neglected for quite a period of time until I think the Women's Auxiliary took over and tried to restore the cemetery. Also, the Friends, and Bob, you said the Friends rented out a section of the Camden burial ground to try to get funds to restore or maintain the cemetery.
Yeah, they rented the old meeting house and a portion of the grounds and raised money to restore the grounds here at Newton Burial Ground. But I think the Society of Friends are a lot more practical about graveyards. They don't really view them as sacred places per se, just like they don't view their meeting house as sacred places. And so I don't think that they are, once you've gone 4 or 5 generations beyond and not continue to be used, it's not some place that really attracts a lot of attention or care. Although clearly the Haddonfield grounds are well maintained, but this one being in disuse, just, part of the problem of the plainness and not being any stones on the Orthodox side, the old Newton Burial Ground side, is that, like you say, most people don't even know it's a graveyard. It looks like a park.
Yeah.
So was that most of the questions?
Yeah. Anything else? Feel free to contact us.
Last one. Has anyone even considered a power washing on some of the stones to see if that would help any, or would it more than help?
Yeah, I think that power washing is kind of frowned upon from what I read. And again, I'm not a historical preservation expert, but from what I've read about tombstones is that kind of amount of pressure behind the water could actually break the stone up because of the age. So with the D2 biological solution, it's supposed to not degrade the stone or discolor the stone. And then you just use a gentle flow of water to rinse it off. But everything's plastic tools, nylon brushes, stuff like that doesn't affect the integrity of the stone.
Thank you. So I think we're going to call it a night. Just so everybody knows, the Historical Society will be posting this video on YouTube. It was recorded And once it's edited, we will post it and we will send an email to everybody who attended so that you are aware. And if anybody would like Bob or Sean's contact information, if you have not already recorded it or written it down from what's posted here, please feel free to email us and we will send it out to you as soon as you reach out to us, or if you have any questions, or you can call us at the office as well. So this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for everybody from tuning in. It was great.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, everybody have a good night.
Thank you.
Have a good one.